In the quiet nation of Karlsway, though nation might be too formal a word for a place that never quite decided what it wanted to be, there are forests that seem older than memory, and older still than the idea of memory itself. No one agrees exactly when the forests began. Some say they grew from the last breath of a forgotten giant. Others say they were always there, and the rest of the world simply formed around them, like water finding its way around a stone. But if you were to walk there, slowly because the ground insists upon it, you would notice something first before anything else. The stillness. Not silence exactly. Silence would suggest an absence. Karlsway's forests are not empty. They are full. Full of small sounds layered gently, like blankets folded one over another. There is the sound of wind, but not the kind that rushes. Leans. It lingers. It threads its way between branches, touching leaves in a slow, thoughtful manner, as if it has all the time in the world, and it does. There are birds too. Not bright, hurried birds, but patient ones. Their calls come at long intervals, soft and rounded, as though each note must be considered before it is given. Some of them sing in pairs, though the second bird often answers long after the first, so long that you might forget the question before the reply arrives. And then, beneath it all, there is the subtle shifting of the trees themselves. Because in Karlsway, the trees are never entirely still. These trees are tall, though not in the way that demands attention. They do not tower dramatically. They simply continue upward until you stop noticing where they end. Their bark is textured in long, quiet spirals, like something that once moved but has since decided to rest. Their leaves are not a single color either. Some are green, of course, but others carry hints of ash gray or a soft, muted blue, or even a kind of dim gold that only appears when the light is just right. And the light in these forests is always just slightly different from what you expect. It filters slowly, as though it must pass through many layers of thought before reaching the ground. If you follow one of the narrow paths, though path might be too strong a word, as they tend to appear only when you are not looking directly at them, you might eventually come upon one of the forest's quieter inhabitants, the sloth. Though, if you ask anyone in Karlsway, they will call it the eight-toed sloth. And they will say it with confidence. They will tell you that long ago, when the first naturalist, whose name has been mostly forgotten, except that it might have been Elrin or perhaps Elrin or something close to that, discovered the creature, he counted 8 toes. Very carefully. Twice even. It was only much later, after sketches were made and papers written, and arguments politely exchanged, that someone noticed the error. There were in fact only 6 toes. The original sloth, it seems, had been resting upon a branch in such a way that 2 curled leaves had been mistaken for toes. Leaves that happened to match the slow, quiet shape of the creature's feet. But by then it was too late. The name had settled. And the sloth itself did not seem concerned with correcting anyone. The 8-toed sloth, 6-toed if we are being precise, moves in a manner that is almost difficult to perceive. Not because it is fast. Quite the opposite. It moves so slowly that your mind, accustomed to change, struggles to register it at all. You may look at a branch, see the sloth resting there, and look away. When you look back, it will appear unchanged. But if you were to remain for an hour, though few people ever do, you might notice that it has shifted. Just slightly. A fraction closer to the trunk, or perhaps a fraction farther from it. It is said that if you watch long enough, you will begin to feel that time itself is slowing to match the creature. Though no one has confirmed this. Mostly because no one has watched long enough. Further south, where the trees grow a little thinner and the ground begins to soften underfoot, the forests give way to the swamps. These swamps are known, in the way that only quiet places can be known. Not for danger, not for mystery, but for their sound. At dusk, when the air becomes thick and the light folds into itself, the toads begin to sing. Now, sing might not be the word you expect. There are no melodies, no rising crescendos or intricate patterns. Just a low, steady rib bit. But it is not one toad. It is many. And they do not begin all at once. One starts. Then another somewhere deeper in the reeds. Then another farther still. Until the swamp is filled with these low, rounded notes, overlapping gently, never quite in rhythm, but never clashing either. It is less like a song and more like breathing. The swamp inhales. The swamp exhales. And if you stand there long enough, you might find your own breath beginning to match it. Between the forests and the swamps, in places where the ground is soft but not wet, there grow the small mushrooms known as fairy chairs. No one knows who named them. The name simply exists, as though it always has. They grow in clusters, tight, close-knit circles, sometimes spiraling outward, sometimes forming small, uneven lines that lead nowhere in particular. By day they are unremarkable, easily overlooked. But at night they begin to glow. Not brightly, never brightly. Just a faint, gentle luminescence, like the memory of light rather than light itself. If you were to walk through the forest at night, and again slowly because Karlsway does not allow for anything else, you might see them dotting the ground like distant stars that have decided to settle among the roots. And sometimes, though this is not something that can be proven, it is said that the glow pulses. Not in a pattern, not in a signal, but in something that feels almost like thought. There are stories, of course. There are always stories. Some say that if you sit among the fairy chairs very still and do not speak, you may hear something. Not with your ears, but in the quiet place just behind your thoughts. Others say that the 8-toed sloth once had 8 toes, truly, and that it gave 2 away to the forest itself, though no one agrees on why. And there are those who insist that the singing toads of the southern swamps are not singing at all, but remembering something that the rest of Karlsway has long since forgotten. But Karlsway is not a place that demands belief. Does not ask you to decide what is true. Simply continues. The trees continue to shift, almost imperceptibly. The birds continue to call, waiting patiently for answers that may or may not come. The sloth continues to move in its slow and certain way, unconcerned with how many toes it is said to have. The toads continue their low, steady chorus. And the fairy chairs continue to glow, softly, gently, as though they are keeping watch over something that does not need guarding. If you were to remain there long enough to stop measuring time in the usual ways, you might begin to notice something else. Not a sound, not a sight, but a feeling that the forest is not old in the way we think of age. It is not worn. It is not tired. It is simply ongoing. Like a sentence that has no need for an ending. Like a thought that is content to continue, without ever needing to arrive. And perhaps that is why people come to Karlsway, though they rarely say so out loud. Not to discover anything, not to solve anything, but to be part of something that does not rush, something that does not demand, something that allows you to simply exist, in the same quiet way that the trees and birds and sloths and toads do. And if you were to sit there now, just for a moment or perhaps for much longer than that, you might notice the wind moving again through the leaves. Slowly, gently, as though it too has nowhere else to be. And somewhere not too far away a single bird calls. And after a long while, another answers. And if for whatever reason you were to leave the forests of Karlsway, though most who enter do not feel any particular urgency to do so, you might find yourself gradually walking east. Not by intention necessarily, but because the land begins to suggest it. The ground firms beneath your steps. The trees, while still present, begin to thin in a way that feels less like absence and more like a gentle stepping aside, as though they are making room for something older still. The air changes too. It grows drier, though not harshly so. The softness of the forest lingers behind you, but ahead there is a quiet clarity, like a thought that has finally decided to take shape. And then, after some time that is difficult to measure in Karlsway, you begin to see them. The Redstone Mountains. They do not rise suddenly. Nothing in Karlsway does. Instead, they begin as suggestions along the horizon. A faint unevenness where the sky meets the land. A line that refuses to remain straight. As you continue, that line deepens, darkens, and slowly takes on color. Not gray. Not the distant blue of ordinary mountains. But red. A deep, earthen red, like clay warmed by a long-forgotten sun. The closer you come, the more the color reveals itself. The stone is layered, not sharply, but in long, patient bands that seem to have settled one upon another over ages that no one has counted. Each layer holds a slightly different shade, some closer to rust, others to a muted crimson, and some so dark they nearly return to brown. And then, higher still, the snow begins quietly, a dusting at first, caught in crevices and along ledges where the wind has chosen to rest. But as the mountains rise, so too does the snow, until it gathers in soft, unbroken fields that stretch across the upper slopes. White against red. Still against still. The contrast is not sharp, not jarring, but balanced in a way that feels almost deliberate, as though the mountains themselves had decided long ago that this is how they wish to be seen. These mountains form the eastern border of Karlsway. Though border, like nation, is perhaps too rigid a word. There are no markers, no walls, no signs to tell you where Karlsway ends and something else might begin. There are only the mountains, and the quiet understanding that beyond them things are different, not worse, not better, just no longer Karlsway. The wind behaves differently here. In the forests it lingers. In the swamps it settles. But in the Redstone Mountains, it moves with purpose. Not fast. Never fast. But steadily, tracing the slopes, slipping between ridges, carrying with it a low, continuous sound that is not quite a howl and not quite a hum. If you listen carefully, it almost resembles the distant echo of the singing toads from the southern swamps, but stretched thin, drawn out, as though the mountains have taken that sound and made it their own. There are birds here too. Fewer than in the forest. Their calls are sharper, more defined, as if shaped by the open space around them. They circle slowly on unseen currents, rarely flapping their wings, content to be carried. Sometimes if you watch long enough you might notice that they follow certain paths, loops and arcs that repeat, not exactly but closely enough to suggest memory. And then, in the lower reaches of the mountains, where the red stone begins to meet the last wandering roots of the forest, there are small things. Not quite plants, not quite stones. Clusters of hardened red growths that resemble the fairy chairs, though they do not glow. Some say they are what the fairy chairs become when they wander too far east. Others say they are something entirely different, something that has simply chosen a similar shape. No one has stayed long enough to decide. There are stories here as well. Quieter ones, less often told. It is said that the first naturalist, the one who counted the sloth's toes, once came to the Redstone Mountains and attempted to measure their height. He began carefully, marking his progress, noting each incline, each shift in the stone. But somewhere along the way his notes became sparse, then inconsistent, and eventually they stopped altogether. Not because he left, but because, as one version of the story goes, he simply forgot what he had been trying to measure. He sat down somewhere along the slope where the red stone meets the first true stretch of snow, and listened to the wind for a very long time. When he finally returned, though no one knows exactly when, he spoke only of how the mountains did not need to be measured. They already knew how tall they were. If you were to climb them yourself, you might begin with purpose, step by step, a destination in mind. But Karlsway has a way of softening such intentions. The higher you go, the more the world below begins to blur, not visually but conceptually. The forests, the swamps, the fairy chairs, the slow-moving sloth, they do not disappear, but they feel less like separate places and more like parts of a single continuous thought. And the mountains, they are not apart from that thought. They are simply where it rises. And so, at some point you might stop. Not because you are tired, not because you have reached the top, but because stopping feels like the natural continuation of walking. You might sit on the red stone, cool beneath you despite the light. You might notice the snow nearby, untouched, holding its quiet shape. You might hear the wind moving past, steady and certain. And if you listen closely, very closely, you might think you hear something beneath it. Something familiar. A low, distant rhythm. Not quite a rib bit. Not quite a breath. But something that belongs to both. And far behind you, though distance is difficult to measure in Karlsway, the forests continue. The trees shift slowly. The birds call patiently. The eight-toed sloth, 6 if we are being precise, moves in its quiet, unnoticed way. The fairy chairs glow as night returns. The toads sing. The mountains stand. And Karlsway, as it always has, continues. Not toward an ending, but gently, endlessly,